morning, good afternoon. Welcome to our Women in ESG Compliance live webinar. I'm Carol Lemos. I'm the Marketing Director for Close Match in EMEA, and I'm going to be moderating these webinar today. First of all, I'd like to thank everybody for signing up and showing up, and especially our guest panelists. So today we have here with us Lisa Beth Lentini Walker. She's an Assistant General Counsel of Marqeta, a fintech company based in Oakland, California, and the CEO of Lumen Worldwide Endeavors, a firm specializing in compliance, governance, and ethics consulting. She co-authored the book Raise Your Game, Not Your Voice: How Listening, Communicating, and Storytelling Shape Compliance Program Influence in 2021. We also have with us Sarah Sinclair, who is the co-founder of ChangeGap, and Irina Volkova, who is a director at Grant Thornton's Financial Services Advisory Practice, and she leads the firm's work in ESG regulation. So welcome to all of our panelists. Before we get started with our panelists, we do have an opening poll for the attendees. So if you could be so kind and answer our poll. So what stage of the ESG journey are you at? Not started, still accessing the ESG landscape for your organization, very early stages, have a strategy in place but have not started implementing it, or we are implementing our strategy and working towards targets. I'll give you a few seconds to respond. I'm still missing a few people, so if you could answer the question, that would be awesome. Okay. I will go ahead and end the poll. So most of the respondents, 67%, said that they are implementing strategy and working towards targets. And second, we have people who are still accessing the ESG landscape for their organization, and also people who have a strategy in place but have not started implementing it yet. And with that, I'll go to my first question to our panelists. So ladies, why should companies start thinking about ESG strategies now rather than later? Sarah, do you want to go first?
Yeah, thank you very much. So it's very timely, this topic now. My perspective, I see ESG in the same bucket as regulatory implementations, in that you always need more time than you think, right? So I think the key thing with ESG strategies is it needs to cover the whole organization. It needs a sort of root and branch review of purpose and strategy, and then for that to percolate throughout the organization in terms of what that means for the operations and all parts of the organization. And when it comes to the data part and reporting, which is a key part, as well as the impact side, again, you just need time, and there are so many key gaps in terms of understanding, in terms of the taxonomy, which disclosure standards you're going to report against, and there's lots of people grappling for answers. So there's lots of data vendors as well trying to sell data. There's firms trying to buy data like it's going out of fashion, panicking. Yeah, ultimately you need time, and it takes time to embed, properly throughout an organization. So that would be my view.
Thank you, Sarah. Lisa Beth, do you want to go next?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing that we need to discuss is you don't know what you don't know, right? You don't know where your gaps are if you've never examined what your baseline is. And so I view ESG as, it is a constellation of many different risks from many different areas. And to the extent that you haven't looked at this as part of your risk portfolio, like now is the time to really start paying attention, because there are more and more regulations that are coming online in the United States, in Europe, in Australia, in various locations around the world. And companies are being held to higher and higher standards, and not just by regulators. When you think about ESG, I really like to think of it as the way that an organization manifests its values and actions. And the way that an organization chooses to navigate the world is something that many stakeholders care about. You've got stakeholders in so many different areas, whether it's the communities that you work in, the people that you currently have as employees or would like to have as prospective employees, the counterparties with whom you are doing business, whether those are customers, clients, groups in your supply chain, et cetera. So companies need to be thoughtful and strategic about how they navigate the world. It's kind of like, an unexamined life, is it worth living? That has been a, perpetual philosophical question. I would ask the same of organizations. An unexamined approach to navigating the world means that you are likely less effective at prioritizing and properly placing resources than you would be if you took the time and energy to understand your role within the world and how you're choosing to navigate it. But from a why now perspective, what we're seeing is a lot of changes in terms of regulations. In the European Union, you've got the CSRD, or the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. In the United States, if you're a publicly listed company, there are new rules coming out on climate change. There are new regulations around board diversity, particularly for NASDAQ listed companies. There are additional focuses on cybersecurity and a whole host of other things. And depending on the industry you're in, there may be other elements that are popping up across the board in terms of what is expected of you as a provider, a supplier, a partner, an employer, a community member, et cetera. So to be willfully blind to what is happening around you, I think organizations, are deciding to take a risk that may or may not be untenable. But if you don't know what the risks are, it's really a difficult choice to defend right now.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Irina, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, thank you. Well, I think never have we been in a situation where almost all stakeholders that businesses interact with sort of speak with the same voice, in the sense that I think the market, particularly in the EU and UK and a lot of Asia and Africa, actually has never been clearer in terms of investor demand and pressure for firms to adopt sustainable practices and ESG strategies as part of that. There is a very clear desire on behalf of employees, of course, as well, and the wider stakeholder group to engage with companies who are really versed into sustainability. And I would say, not the least, very importantly, and particularly for a heavily regulated market here in the UK, there's a huge regulatory pressure. There is a massive plethora of requirements coming into play. And some of those are already mentioned, but perhaps just to illustrate how much actually is coming into play now and in the next sort of year to 18 months. I work in the financial services sort of sector, and obviously that's historically has been one of the most regulated sectors, particularly here in the UK, and obviously ESG is no exception to that. But to give you an example, the UK is the first country to actually mandated the TCFD disclosures for publicly listed companies and large private companies, with intention to extend the scope of the companies called by this requirement to pretty much 2/3 of all regulated businesses in the UK by 2025. Similarly, we do already have a mandatory requirement for implementing net zero transition plans for all large and listed companies. And from what we hear from TPT, which is the Task Force on Transition Plans, and regulators, this is likely to expand again to the majority of the regulated firms here in the UK. So even just these two things are such a huge undertaking. And when you overlay that with the green finance strategy, for example, that the UK just released in the end of March, which basically is entirely focused on tackling climate change, biodiversity loss, and environmental degradation, and the role of the financial services that as a sector that plays into that, and the whole focus on greening finance, it just gives you the enormous scope of the exercise the regulators here undertaking. I think another important point, which is, again, just a demonstration as to how serious regulators about it and legislators are, is the new Financial Services and Markets Bill, which is currently in the UK Parliament, which is introducing a new regulatory principle for regulators to having to contribute to achieving net zero and preserving nature. So again, once, of course, the regulators have got those powers, you can only imagine that is going to be even further activity in terms of regulatory requirements. And then globally, of course, there are things such as the TNFD, the Task Force on Nature-related Financial Disclosures, which basically just released its final framework, and it's going to be sort of incorporated or sort of released, if you like, for adoption later this year. Very similarly, the International Sustainability Standards Board basically has been set up to sort of implement standards across industries going forward, which are expected September this year. And again, both the EU and the UK have already said they're going to adopt those widely and recognize them and incorporate them in their regulatory sort of landscape. So there's an enormous amount in terms of regulatory activity coming, even if you kind of limit it to the UK. And of course, the EU, with again, CSRD was already mentioned, but things such as SFDR, which is the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation, of which we have an UK version here, which is the Sustainable Disclosure Regime, which we're expecting the final rules later this year again. The EU taxonomy, with the counterparty, if you like, in the as the green taxonomy here in the UK. The new corporate sort of sustainability due diligence directive the EU is working on, and it's just like almost an ever-growing body, if you like, of regulation. So I think, going back to the original question, this was just to literally give you a sort of almost an extract of what's in the EU, the UK market. But I think the most important bit of that is just that this really illustrates how serious the regulators are, that this is a one-directional journey, and it sort of plays along the interest of all stakeholders that businesses interact. And I think whether organizations decide to sort of adopt sustainable practices or not is going to define their future.
Great. And from a business perspective, what do you see as the key benefits of implementing an ESG strategy? Can I come to you, Elizabeth, first?
Sure. As you look at what the benefits are of an ESG strategy, I think, as I mentioned before, this is really a constellation and has so many different stakeholders that are interested and invested in what an organization chooses to do, and realize that choosing to do nothing or to remain ignorant of what your stance is a choice in itself as well. But ultimately, there are many, many, many studies out there that show that companies that are more ethical, that companies that have clearly defined priorities and take the time to invest beyond just doing the business end up faring better over the long term, financially, and in terms of investing by your shareholders or whatever your investor profile looks like. It can provide a competitive advantage when you're up for RFP. And I am seeing with increasing kind of urgency and increasing weighting requests for proposals that incorporate ESG elements, whether it's making sure that there isn't human trafficking in your supply chain, or having a supplier code of conduct, or something else that sets out the standards and expectations. I mean, what I always like to say is one of the biggest impairments to relationships of any kind, whether they're business to business or human relationships, is unmet expectations. So being very clear on expectations and your approaches actually helps reduce a lot of the noise that clogs up relationships in the corporate world, and frankly, in your own personal life. But that's a topic for another day. But it does help drive clarity, consistency, competitive advantage, and it helps to attract and retain talent. As we're seeing more and more of Gen Z, there are numerous studies that are coming out that are saying more than the majority of the new entrants to the market in terms of the workplace prioritize values-driven organizations as the ones that they would prefer to work for and are more loyal to it. And as we think about human capital, which is another entire area that is requiring additional disclosure and attention, the cost to organizations of not doing this in terms of your ability to attract and retain people amongst the newer entrants to the market is going to become significant at a certain point in time. I think we're getting there at this point in time. And when a person has multiple offers from multiple organizations, they start looking at all of the things that an organization offers. It's not just the compensation and benefits. They want to know, when I wake up in the morning, can I look myself in the mirror and feel good about what I'm doing and where I'm working? And that is tied into how an organization communicates its commitments to navigate the world, the planet that we share, and the people that an organization interacts with.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point, actually. Irina, do you have anything to add? Any additional thoughts?
Well, other than obviously avoiding paying fines for non-compliance with requirements, which I think has a strong sort of business incentive to comply with the ESG part, if you like. I think there's huge sort of reputational gain from doing that at this particular moment of time. And that's mainly because firms who are seen to pioneer, if you like, sustainable practices are really much better placed, in my view, to attract not only talent, as Elizabeth mentioned, but which is, I think, extremely important point, but also, in a way, better investors, better customers, better business partners, which overall contribute to see better performance. It's a very simple logic. It's not really rocket science, but I think there's a huge sort of reputational gain. Of course, it is a huge reputational risk related to that and potential greenwashing considerations. But having said that, I think companies that are serious about it and really committed can absolutely gain from that. And I think the other point I would mention is that we should not forget that ESG is also a way of risk managing, because obviously these are real risks. We shouldn't be thinking about it as something quite abstract and say, oh, it's a bunch of requirements, here's a bunch of documents that you build your strategy, etc. This is actually real risks that society faces, that nature and our planet that we all live in actually face. So this actually means cost. And of course, better ESG risk management means actually reducing and managing that cost going forward. So I think that is, in my view, very, very huge sort of a business gain if you really do things right.
Great, thank you. And talking about risks and pitfalls, what should companies be aware of when implementing an ESG strategy? What are the potential pitfalls? Irina?
For me, the most important bit is not to do it mechanically, not with a sort of off-the-shelf solution or take it as a tick boxing exercise, frankly. I think firms really need to sort of spare the time and find the room to really assess what's the impact on their business and how they as a business impact on all sorts of sustainability matters, and then come up with a vision which is sort of realistic and can facilitate the transition, whether that's in their operations in particular, in terms of reducing emissions or better preserving nature, or whether that's tackling some sort of social considerations or any other aspects of the ESG agenda, or whether that's via the investment side, if you like, for what they do as a business. I think there's a huge opportunity to really stand back, think about it, and actually say, okay, well, this is what we can sign up as a vision. This is what we think we can realistically achieve, and then really align this to our business model and our overall business strategy and see how we go about it. So for me, that's where it all starts. Everything else is just an add-on, but the first piece is that.
Great. Sarah, do you have any opinion on that? Anything to add on these questions?
Yeah, I think this links to the last question, right? So because the worst thing you can do is do it as a tick box, and so you know, where do you start? Well, you start from the top down and make sure that you don't do it as tick box, and that is the same as other regulations. So many financial institutions spend so much money year after year trying to sort out their data or their reporting or their other processes to comply with the regulation because it hasn't been done properly before. So this is a golden opportunity to, you know, try to do it properly, and that there is so much more at stake now. It's not that there wasn't before, but you know, there really is. It's almost like a last chance saloon to, you know, to get it right, you know, with the world's eyes on everyone, right? And as Lisa, Beth and Irina have you know, explained, it cuts across you know, to investors, to people like your employees, and yeah, so it really does impact everyone. And you know, it is strange because I think a lot of people get caught in that trap of thinking, oh, it's a regulation or this has been mandated on us, and almost feel annoyed or like, oh, you know, just do something and it will go away, or in the worst case, don't do anything and just wait for the fine, you know. So really you want the opposite action, and to really do it genuinely, because it will, like the ESG, the impact of the ESG requirement is that people, whether it's consumers, employees, or investors or regulators, they will get better at sort of seeing the, you know, the gaps and the sort of holes in people's sort of statements about their ESG policies. So I think it's about taking that holistic approach. So looking at the requirements, doing it properly, you know, linking the requirements to policies and to your risks that you're managing in a constellation, as Lisbeth said, and then the controls around that. And yeah, also I think, you know, making sure that you take an eyes wide open approach. So I mean, data, pitfall, and if you don't start that early enough or have a sort of holistic approach to that, or sort of mitigating approach as to, you know, what you can do about data gaps or who you can work with collaboratively to address those gaps. So yeah, it's trying to preempt the risks and get on the front foot.
Perfect. I have a question for you, another question for you guys. What 3 components you think should be included in an ESG strategy to minimize risks and make compliance thrive? So I'm coming, Lisa, Beth, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I would be happy to go. And one of the things that I would say, kind of speaking to the prior question, is I would rather have at least a tick box where someone is looking at this than to have complete ignorance, but that is not optimal, right? One of the things that we've spent a bit of time talking about today is the upcoming regulations and all of the things that need to be done to meet the mark. While it's very important to be mindful of regulations, and as a lawyer, you know, I work with the rules. I think in order for this to actually thrive, you need to be focused on communication and values and deeper meaning and purpose, because what we know about human behavior is that if there is a rule that you are trying to meet, if there is a requirement and people are not embracing that requirement because they're being told what they need to do, we'll typically see behaviors which get you to the point that you have met the mark and you can make the pain stop, right? It's one of those challenges that we have in the law and in general, is that when you're telling people what to do and they don't feel like they have choices, they are less likely to A, want to comply, and B, give it any extra effort. So I think it's important to acknowledge that rules exist. It's important to design your program so that you, at the very least, meet the rules. But at the end of the day, how we communicate and how we engage people in this part of the business, because it is part of the business, it is part of the risk portfolio, it is part of how management is going to need to understand how, you know, the world that the organization sits in. That communication element, that deeper meaning and purpose, that values tie for why you're doing the things that you're doing is really critical to get buy-in and advocacy in a sustainable fashion. Because otherwise, my fear is that many organizations will take the approach that this is something we have to do, not something we want to do. The want should be going before the have to. The have to kind of follows on because you want to do, you know, the right thing, and you want to create an environment that's, you know, great for your children, for the company for the next 50 years, because we have one planet. We have one opportunity in a lifetime to make a difference. And if we don't embrace that and find ways to inspire people to engage, then it's really difficult for compliance to thrive, or for ESG to thrive, or the planet, or the people on this rock that we like to call ours. So that's what I would really emphasize, is how you put the communications and how you connect with that deeper purpose really matters in terms of whether you're going to end up with a, you know, we met the mark and did the bare minimum, versus this is a how we live and how we decide, make decisions type of equation.
Yeah, it's about embedding it into the culture of the company, you know, not just ticking the box, as you guys have said. I'll come next to Irina. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, well, very similar in a way. Perhaps I come from a slightly more formulaic approach, just because I tend to work with obviously regulations, so we're very structured in the way we do things, and usually strategy and implementing the strategy is not very different to any other sort of massive overhaul changes in terms of regulations. But you do have to sort of think about the vision and the piece and the purpose that Elizabeth talked about. So that's your really starting point. And without that, you can't really progress. Then you need to put the right governance in place, which is really supporting the introduction and the implementation, if you like, of that strategy. And then, of course, it comes to making sure that you do have the right implementation tools, so that you've got the right risk management processes, that you've got the right framework in place in terms of arrangements, that you've got the right control. So everything that sort of supports the successful implementation of the strategy and embedding it into the business needs to come into play into that part. And then, of course, you have some sort of an ongoing monitoring, if you like, as to how you perform against that strategy. So you need to, at the start, even think very carefully about your targets and how you measure those targets, how you monitor them, how you report against that. And this kind of gives you the whole sort of cycle, if you like, how we go about your ESG strategy. And it is sort of the proven methodology. And if you look at, for example, the principles that the TCFD or the TNFD uses, it's very similar sort of kind of approach in terms of what logic you should follow. But and again, as Elizabeth said, that is all very good in theory. The most important bit is that whatever you sign up to, you really believe in as an organization, and that really is at the heart of everything you do, because it's not what's on the paper and the policies, it's about your day-to-day behaviors.
Perfect. Sarah, anything to add?
Yeah, I noted down the need, I think, to collaborate on this, almost be ESG about the way we do ESG. Not all try and do our own thing in silos, which costs more and get some non-optimal results. So I think access to external and common and trusted sources of insights, data, and capabilities, whether that's experts who can help interpret the law, the regulation, the policies and different approaches, or systems. All right. So I talk as a technologist. I feel there's already too much technology out there trying to help in the ESG space, and that actually makes it more difficult for firms to embrace, because there definitely is a big role that technology can play, and I know we're going to talk about that in a bit. But so yeah, I hear very frequently about this overwhelm and the sense of just don't know where to turn. I mean, if in a lot of big firms, there's a head of sustainability or head of ESG and head of climate and so on. All these people can't be experts to the same level, so we do have to find a way to have access to external support.
Yeah, makes sense. And as you said, my next question is really about technology. So how can technology actually be your ally to meet ESG obligations and build a strong foundation for ESG in your company?
So shall I kick that off, and then
yeah,
we can hear from Elizabeth and Narina? So I think, well, I know that ESG is this sort of exciting space that is already crowded, as I say, with various vendors and data providers offering solutions. And there's some great ones. I've seen great ones, but there's also many others. And if you're sitting in a firm trying to work out how you're going to meet the requirements and how you're going to get good data and reporting and communications across company, then yeah, it's going to be very overwhelming and confusing. I would say generally the best way to tackle things like this is to start knowing exactly what you want rather than just dashing in, because you'll avoid the risk of buying something that then turns out you didn't quite need that, there's something else better. But also the market is still very much maturing. So I think the key thing is to recognize that technology does and will play a big role, a key role. It will give you a more robust view of the risks that you're managing and how you're making progress. And obviously the reporting will be more trusted. Yeah, do a proper market scan, get help, on that, to understand the different offerings. And I think the third thing is not get locked in. I've heard of various providers trying to lock you in, and that's probably a bit of a red flag, because it is too early really to get locked in. So you also need that flexibility. All right, so probably not get all of your technology from one provider. Some providers would be better at the data provision, data sources. Others will be better at the sort of mapping of the rules to the requirements, policies, controls, and so on. and others will be better at the tools, the sort of front end dashboards to help you know how compliant you are and so on. So I think that component approach is a good strategy, and that applies to any technology, not just ESG.
Yeah, picking the best in class instead of going for somebody who can offer you everything, but not necessarily the way you need it to be.
That's right.
Yeah,
the Lego approach.
Yeah, makes sense. Irina, what are your thoughts on these questions?
Yeah, no, I think Sarah's absolutely right. There are quite a few different angles, and technology certainly has got a big role to play. I think it's admirable the FCA's effort here in the UK to try and tackle the ESG kind of rating agencies, because clearly that is a sea of providers that everybody can get lost in. And you don't always get to the right answer, frankly. And throughout the work we've been doing, and I've been doing the last 3-4 years, I've seen so many firms that dived into buying different data sets, for example, just so that they have something without, to Sarah's point, being clear at all what they need this data for. So I've almost tried to stop them and tell them, just please do not buy any data tools, because this is really not going to help you. So unless you're clear on what your requirements are and what you have to report against, so to be able to identify the relevant data, please just don't spend unnecessary money on that. Obviously, firms have different approaches, but I think in terms of access to data, clearly that is critical, and I think is going to have a bigger role going forward. And once it's become sort of more regulated even, or kind of some sort of clarity is provided, that's going to certainly help the market. I think the second biggest role is indeed around ESG compliance and risk management. So the work you guys at Closematch do, for example, is clearly an area where your technology and you as a RegTech can certainly support firms in actually ensuring that they remain compliant with the ESG requirements, and that they have tools in place to make sure that they appropriately manage the risks. And then again, as Sarah mentioned, there is the assurance piece and the role of technology in that. So basically just making sure that you do know how you benchmark against others. And again, that's sort of a data point. And I think it's still very subjective in terms of how we source that data. But there is a role for that. And once this crystallizes going forward, I think technology is going to become really an ally, as you said, Carol.
Thank you, Irina. Elisabeth, your thoughts?
Yeah, I would echo what Sarah and Irina have said. Ultimately, technology is a tool. Technology is a tool. It's not necessarily an answer to every question. It is a tool that can help you answer many questions. And it is also an area of potential risk. So know your counterparties, know who you're sharing data with, of course. But we are going to be asked, I think, in the very near term, to start looking at all sorts of automations, API integrations, and figuring out how to leverage the tools that are now available in really effective ways. What that means is making sure that, right, from a data hygiene perspective, like good data in, and then you're likely to get some good data out. But if you don't have good source data to begin with, then you may be really challenged. So technology will help going forward if we use it wisely, if we use it to understand landscape, and we use it to make sure that we understand what's happening throughout an organization. It is far more efficient and effective than like a manual review or anything else. But we're still in, I think, what I would call our infancy of understanding how technology can be a friend. And I think that there are going to be lots of use cases and lots of ways that we experiment with technology in the coming months and years, some of which we may determine aren't really the best uses, whether it's artificial intelligence and chat GPT doing your messaging for you or something else. So I think technology is our friend, but we just need to figure out the parameters and how best to use it on a regular basis to get more of what we want and less of what we don't.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. I think that, like in all functions these days with digital transformation, there's a lot of shiny new toy syndrome. So starting with the problem, understanding what you're trying to solve and what you want to get out of it will be key, and not just investing in technology for the sake of it. I have a final question for you guys, and it's taking a step back from the ESG component and thinking about the women in the workplace scenario. Is there anything that you know now as an experienced professional that you wish you knew when you were starting out in your career? So I'll go first to Sarah.
I was going to ask to go last. No, just
that's fine if you want to go last.
No, that's fine. Yeah, it's an interesting question, because in a way you build throughout your life and your career, and you know, whatever you sort of think back on it, it's kind of hindsight, right? You only know because you're looking back. But I guess there is one thing for me, which is kind of confidence, right? You're always looking out in the world, especially growing up and, you know, starting your career. And, you know, you maybe, I don't know if it's just me, but you can have this feeling where you think everyone else knows so much more, you know, so much more confident. And, you know, you're trying to copy other people. And I know part of that is key to learning, but definitely a confidence thing in terms of, you know, everyone has their thing that, you know, to give to the world. And actually, if you focus more on yourself and what you give and using that in a good way, then yeah, that's very sort of constructive and helpful, and you can hone those skills. So I think it's about getting the right blend of, you know, your own confidence, but learning from others. Yeah.
No, that's great. Great advice. Irina, what are your thoughts on this one?
It's a very big question, isn't it? Because you sort of go back and reflect on a number of things that you've done in your life, and you kind of think, would I have done this thing differently, for example, had I known this or that? And probably the answer is in most scenarios, I think when you actually answer this question with a no, it's a good thing. But having said that, I think taking ESG as an example, and I think that sort of almost is applicable to everything else that you do in your life. It's just all so encompassing, and you sort of realize that really late. Well, not late necessarily, but like over time. So again, if you use ESG as an example, so when you start thinking, for example, how the environment interacts, if you like, with the natural resources, carbon emissions, waste management, water, and for example, the impact businesses that have on all that, and we all as individuals have. And then when you overlay that with some sort of social considerations and conflicts, for example, you kind of face a very complex conundrum and just realize how very connected is everything, and everything you do has an impact. And of course, in order to solve the ESG conundrum, for example, but again, bringing it back to more holistically to everything else you do, you kind of try and not impair anybody's interest. So it's quite of a tricky balancing exercise, if you like, that you always have to do. And I think from the ESG perspective going forward, we are sort of facing a very difficult journey that everybody will have to give in something to make a step change. But again, on the more broader side, if you like, we all have to think about how we actually support each other and how we work together in order to make sure that we achieve the results that we really all are going to benefit from. So it's this kind of piece around, it is sort of overwhelming for everybody. It's not just for you as an individual, and we all have a role to play in that.
Great. Elizabeth?
Well, one of the things that I wish that I had known more when I started out my career is this, ESG, working in organizations, it really is a team sport. And also often in many of what I like to call the guardian professions. These are the people who are responsible for maintaining integrity and governance in organizations. So think people in your finance structures, your people organization or HR, legal, audit, information security, all of those kind of unsung heroes that make sure that there is integrity in the markets, integrity in financial statements, integrity in, organizations. We're often trained to be kind of solo practitioners, like we become subject matter experts, we get deep in these concepts, and early on in our careers, our ability to analyze and present on complex technical accounting or whatever it is really prized. But as we go through life, it becomes so much more apparent that we are stronger together. We move faster if we are a team. And I don't believe that, early on in my career, that those, what they like to call soft skills, but I absolutely hate that term. I prefer to call them life skills, right? Those life skills of how we influence when we don't have a power hierarchy, how we get buy-in, how we lead from behind, in the middle, or in the front of the line, right? All of those skills are not what is prioritized early on in a career, and your ability to work with others, get the best out of the people that you're working with, and come up with joint solutions and get the buy-in you need is not what was emphasized early on, at least for me. And so I think that had I known early on how important those skills would be, and how transformational understanding leadership and communication and management would be in my career, I probably would have spent a little more time on the people aspect. Because at the end of the day, like, we're messy, we're all trying to do, for the most part, our best, right? And understanding some of the ins and outs of how organizations work, kind of the organizational behavior, and how we can get to better solutions together would have been really helpful earlier on in my career. And it's still helpful to be reminded of every single day, because sometimes the busyness of life, the busyness of what's happening within the organization, and the pulls and pushes from the various aspects of your life distract you from what, the bigger purpose and the bigger projects and the bigger goals are. And so I would just say, if I had known that earlier, I probably would have done a lot more work in organizational psychology and in leadership courses, because I think those are the things that really matter as you continue in your career.
Couldn't agree more. Yeah. And I also agree that not much emphasis is given when you're very young on this kind of skill. I have an opening, a closing poll for the attendees, and then we're going to open up for questions. So I'm going to open the poll, but whoever is with us attending the webinar, please feel free to pop in your questions in the Q&A button. So let me open the closing poll. So if you're struggling with your ESG strategy, what do you need help with the most? Understanding the data, getting buy-in from senior level top management, controls, testing and monitoring, developing policies, or aligning on policies? If you could please answer our closing poll, that would be great. We have a few answers, so just giving it a couple of seconds for people to finish. So yeah, 60% of people listening to us have difficulties with understanding the data for their organization, and 40% with testing and monitoring. Do you ladies have any piece of advice on how to deal with either the data portion of it or the testing and monitoring? And I'll ask for a volunteer who wants to go first. Sarah, Lisa?
Yeah, it's difficult without context, but I'm not surprised that those two are the most difficult areas. I think referencing what was said before in terms of starting early, starting small, having good access to external support as well as your own internal, having that collaborative approach and not getting locked in. So I think it's about doing something, but not thinking you have to do everything. You need a capability to, develop your data and reporting and then testing. So it's a capability that needs to be built either internally in an organization or a hybrid of that and outsourced.
Great.
So,
Isabel?
yeah, I would add in on, one other thing that I wish I would have known earlier in my career is how much data analytics is going to be asked for later on. That was like not on the radar early, and now it's all about data and understanding technology. In terms of understanding your data, I mean, right, we've known for years that what you measure gets managed. And there's so much data that's available if you just look for it. Part of this is learning how to ask the right questions, because you're going to get data that reflects the questions that you ask. And I think that design process of understanding what data is available, what you could query against the data, and really becoming more fluent in the data that you collect, the data that you have, and what you can do with that data is going to be something that is a unique skill set in and of itself that will be very helpful going forward.
Right. Irina?
Yeah, I was just going to add on to perhaps in the monitoring piece and the testing piece. It's, to be fair, it's something that everybody struggles with from what we see with different businesses. And I think organizations sort of get almost like lost into the over engineering, if you like, of KPIs and other sort of measures they put in place. Whereas actually, I think what's really important is to go back to your objectives and what you're actually trying to achieve, what you're trying to then monitor and measure, and then see how you basically perform against the goals, and then plug in the data into that and see, okay, well, if this is what we're trying to achieve, how are we going to actually measure that? What are the indicators? And it is actually quite simplistic. It doesn't have to be over engineered. And then that is going to, in my view, going to give you the information that you need in terms of data access as well. So I think it's almost like stand back again and think about, okay, what is it that we're trying to achieve here?
Perfect. We have a question from one of our guests, Christopher. He asks you, how important is it for firms to make clear net zero commitments and prove they're sticking to them?
So I'll jump in here on that. I think it depends on your industry and the jurisdictions you operate in. NHS, so in the UK, the National Health System has put a requirement in that all providers that have over £5 million in revenue from NHS need to start, starting pretty much now, going forward for RFPs that are coming in, next year, have to have a board commitment to net zero by 2050. And that needs to be public facing. And if you don't meet that, then you can't be part of the RFP. You automatically fail. So for medical device, other health supply providers, et cetera, if you're doing that in the UK with NHS, it's kind of a cost of doing business. You are either going to do this or you're not going to be eligible for RFP. And I think it varies by industry, it varies by location, whether a firm needs to do it, ought to do it is a different question. Ought to consider it is another question, right? But if you say that you are going to do something in terms of reputational risk, and kind of the trust that others place in the organization, you need to be doing something if you say you are going to be doing something. Otherwise, you run the risk of greenwashing and a whole host of other things. And so you just need to be mindful and really understand your industry, the geographic locations you're working in, what the expectations are in terms of your commitments, and then be truthful in what you say and do.
Perfect. Any additional thoughts from Irina or Sarah?
Yeah, I'll just say that I think Elizabeth is definitely right that it really depends on industry currently. I think going forward to financial services, for example, is sort of expected. There is a proportionality which is applied in terms of how quickly companies come up with their net zero statements, for example, or commitments, but there is sort of expectation that everybody signs up to a version of it. I think going beyond that, though, I think it is very likely that we all will be involved in the transition, and obviously transition is sort of linked to net zero goals. So in one or another form, I think we all have to think about, as businesses and as individuals, how we get to achieve that. And again, how formalized this is really depends on the business you run, and also whether you can indeed commit to what you have promised to do, because as Elizabeth said, the risk of greenwashing is extremely high, and you don't really want to do that. I do think, though, that net zero statements actually help businesses to drive action forward. So you don't necessarily want to go public with it. I think even for internal purposes, I think it's a really, really useful tool to actually support the efforts you're making. So you should think about how you also view the net zero commitments, whether that's your external policy that you want to face the world and therefore you have to really deliver against it, or you want to use it as an internal tool.
Right. Any concluding thoughts from you, Sarah?
Yeah, I think just, almost divide ESG into two buckets. The things, many aspects are going to be very common sense, and try and think about it without the label. It's like we shouldn't really need a regulation or a mandate to, do the right thing by, that's where the world has got to. So, I think the more you can think about how it's good for your business and do it with a common sense approach, the better and proportionate. But the other part is, depending on, as Elizabeth said, your industry and your jurisdiction, how technical and precise you have to be in terms of the measurements, and that's when you need the external support in particular, and your collaboration, because there is a lot of work to do in terms of getting good, data and strategies around, filling the data gaps. So a lot to do, but equally keep it in balance.
Right, thank you so much. So I think we're kind of out of time already. It has been a very pleasant hour with you all. So I'd like to thank you for attending. Thank you for being here with us and sharing your knowledge. Just as a reminder, as part of our Spring Festival event, we still have one event left next week. So if you want to register, you can scan the QR code on your screen or visit closematch.com and you find it there. Thank you so much for all of your insights and for joining us today. And thank you for everybody who attended as well. We will share the recording shortly. You will get it tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.